Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I'm Morris Foster. I'm president of SAR, and we're happy to have you here. Today, we have Alexander Maier, our Paloheimo Fellow for this year. Alexander is a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University. He's going to speak today on In Search of Rizq. I tried very hard to pronounce that. Migration, uncertainty, and the moral economies of mobility in Central Asia. He's going to explore how labor migration from rural Tajikistan and Uzbekistan has become both a moral obligation and a high-stakes gamble. And this is based on 2 years of field work and a lot of work since then. I want to thank our sponsors for supporting these and other SAR events. For those of you who have yet to become members, I want to invite you to join our membership table in the back with our new membership banner. We're very proud of that. And our membership coordinator, Brittany Goodrich, is there, and our advancement ambassador, Kat Bernhardt, is there, and they'll be able to answer your questions and tell you more about our membership opportunities and upcoming members-only offerings. So please consider joining SAR if you're not already a member. Alex, with no further ado, it's yours, and we'll do questions after.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by thanking you all for being here on this beautiful and unseasonably warm day. I also want to thank Morris, Erica, and Paul, as well as all of my cohort mates here at SAR, who make this such a collegial and supportive environment. My talk today is drawn from my dissertation research, which looks at how 3 decades of migration from Central Asia following the breakup of the Soviet Union have changed local societies and economies. The dissertation explores the outsized place that migration has come to occupy in the lives of people in rural communities in contemporary Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. Both of these countries rely heavily on money sent back home by people working abroad, so-called remittances. We all know that migration is, in the first instance, an economic issue, an issue that is driven by the lack of employment and the inability to fulfill material needs and wants in migrants' places of origin. The point that I want to make today, however, is that the impact of migration on the communities and places where it originates and to which migrants return goes far beyond the economic sphere. In the rural parts of Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, where I did my ethnographic fieldwork, migration is, to use an antiquated anthropological term, a total social fact. It is a phenomenon that puts into play the political, religious, legal, economic, and moral aspects of collective and individual life. And what too often gets lost in migration studies are migrants' own perspectives and those of their communities of origin, as my colleague Candy Martinez pointed out in the previous colloquium talk. People's understandings of these other non-economic elements that are involved in migration are often excluded from practices of knowledge-making. Transnational migration has become a defining feature of everyday life in Central Asia. It has reinvigorated domestic economies and conditions future expectations from youth to old age. And my dissertation asks what these expectations, as well as the actual experiences of working as a labor migrant, do to the hopes and visions of a better future that Central Asians pursue. My dissertation shows that labor migration, which is an economic necessity, has also become a moral obligation, and a highly ambivalent one at that. For men, in particular young men, migration has become central to their lives and projects of becoming. It is how they provide for their families and how they guarantee their moral and social standing in their communities of origin. At the same time, because so much of this migration is undocumented and informal, they are exposed to risks that are both physical and ethical. These risks begin with the routes that people take to reach their destinations that often require the services of corrupt migration brokers. And it continues with their actual work in the unregulated and exploitative migrant economies of the global north. Especially in Russia's shadow economy, where most Central Asians find employment, the labor market offers few legal protections and rewards those who trick or cheat their fellow migrant workers. My dissertation explores how migrants relate to this uncertainty that comes with informal and unauthorized migration. It asks, what are the moral economies that shape migrants' aspirations and their sense of obligation toward others, be that their family or fellow migrant workers? To get a grasp of this, I work with two concept metaphors, or emic categories, that I take from my interlocutors. The first one is Rizq. Rizq, which has entered both the Uzbek and Tajik language via Russian, is omnipresent in migrant discourse. Much like elsewhere, Central Asian migrants use the idiom of gambling and chance, of taking a risk, as a way of making sense of their actions in a world that rewards speculation, at least for some. But taking risks doesn't justify immoral and unethical behavior. And the second notion that my interlocutors use to make sense of their lived experience is the Islamic notion of rizq. According to vernacular theology, rizq is the sustenance that God grants to all, but which can only be accessed through righteous effort. Migration has become the predominant way to achieve worldly sustenance in Central Asia, but because God's ways are beyond human comprehension, my interlocutors told me, uncertainty needs to be embraced. And it is precisely this uncertainty that requires a heightened awareness of moral agency and responsibility. Worldly income requires labor, but is not derived from toil alone, and the moral value of one's actions is established vis-à-vis the ethical obligations that humans carry as the recipients of God's beneficence. In my talk today, I will focus on one particular dimension of this moral economy of migration. I take as the basis my fieldwork in rural southern Tajikistan, where Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 caused much worry among those who had relatives working in Russia. I show how the war intensified concerns about the risks of migration, while the simultaneous opening up of new migration pathways to Europe and further west led people to reflect on their negative experiences as migrant workers in Russia, while also articulating positive visions of migrant labor. Based on the trajectories of two of my interlocutors, Zafar and Shafkat, I show how migrant workers try to come to terms with the moral dilemmas in which they find themselves. And I conclude my talk by arguing that the mobility that migrants hope to achieve through migration can sometimes turn into its opposite, a sense of feeling stuck that derives from a vicious cycle of movement. But first, let me give you some background on this part of the world that I assume some of you will know as, for example, a center of Islamic learning, and from its beautiful architecture of its oasis cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, which you can see here. So Uzbekistan and Tajikistan are located just north of Afghanistan and to the west of China. The two rural communities where I conducted most of my fieldwork are located in valleys with an intensely arid climate, actually not too different from New Mexico. Soviet-era irrigation projects that began in the 1920s diverted rivers and created a network of canals that have turned these valleys into the heartland of Soviet cotton production. The majority of the population of Soviet Central Asia was employed on collective farms, growing and harvesting cotton. Cotton became a symbol of the region's economic development. It represented Central Asia's contribution to Soviet internationalism, and the importance of Central Asian cotton production for the Soviet economy was also a source of pride for many Uzbeks, Tajiks, and other Central Asian nationalities. Soviet Central Asia, with its promise of equality and full citizenship to former colonial subjects, also inspired other oppressed groups around the world. The African-American poet Langston Hughes, on the photo on the left, a leading member of the Harlem Renaissance, toured Soviet Central Asia in 1932. In the pamphlet he published, Hughes noted the similarities between the region and the American South as both major producers of cotton. And Hughes wrote favorably of Soviet achievements and anti-racist efforts in Central Asia, which he contrasted to the Jim Crow laws of racial segregation and disenfranchisement in his home country. 40 years later, the political activist and philosopher Angela Davis visited the USSR, and Davis too was taken to Soviet Uzbekistan, where she reportedly praised the emancipation of Central Asian women, and which later led her to write of Soviet internationalism as a potential model for anti-imperialist feminist solidarity. And indeed, Soviet Central Asian achievements were impressive. The massive development of infrastructure, widespread literacy, the establishment of universities, and the creation of a comprehensive healthcare system radically transformed the former Russian colony. But Soviet Central Asia's economy remained dominated by a cotton monoculture, which not only kept the region predominantly agrarian, while other parts of the Soviet Union urbanized rapidly. Cotton monoculture also relied on forced labor, especially during the harvesting season, and the unsustainable irrigation system to grow this water-intensive crop in an arid climate led to severe ecological destruction. This is most visible in the almost complete desiccation of the Aral Sea, which used to be the world's fourth largest lake. But maybe most importantly, cotton monoculture kept Soviet Central Asia economically dependent on Moscow. After the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet economy, Central Asian cotton was not competitive on the world market. Many of the collective farms were privatized, and cotton farmers lost their jobs. Tajikistan was the site of a short-lived but violent civil war following the Soviet Union's dissolution. The dismantling of the region's Soviet-era economy and welfare provisions left working-age men with few options but to seek employment in Russian cities that saw an oil-fueled boom in the 1990s and 2000s. It is almost exclusively men that move abroad for work. They migrate seasonally or temporarily, spending from a few months to a handful of years abroad to then return to their kin, only for this process to repeat, or for a younger brother or son to take over as a provider for the family. This development has made transnational mobility an integral, if contentious, dimension of normative male personhood. As Gastarbeiter, a Russian loan from the German expression for so-called guest workers, Central Asians tend to be employed unofficially with little by way of legal protection, and they often are at the whim of immigration authorities, who act as enforcers of a labor regime that via the always present threat of deportation and incarceration. Labor migrants from Central Asia must also contend with xenophobic violence, discrimination on the housing market, and racial profiling that equates so-called non-Slavic appearance with illegal status. Now, this slide shows a fictional board game by Russian artist Olga Zhitlina. The board game maps out the labyrinthine web of rules, deceptions, bureaucratic hurdles, and traps that define the migration system in contemporary Russia. My original plan for the dissertation had been to carry out most of my research in Russia. Before starting my PhD, I had worked for a migrant rights organization in Moscow that provided legal support to undocumented immigrants and refugees. And Moscow is home to an estimated 2 million migrant workers, most of them from Central Asia. But as I was waiting for my research visa to process in February 2022, Russian tanks rolled over the Ukrainian border, and Russian jets struck Ukrainian cities. Doing research in Russia at war would have endangered my interlocutors and myself. Instead of carrying out fieldwork in places of migration, then I did my fieldwork in the rural communities that most of these migrants hail from. And focusing on places of origin instead of places of destination also changed the focus of my research. It turned into an ethnographic study of how migration is experienced and understood in the places where it originates. So my exploration of the everyday moralities of migrant labor that I will present today draws on a year-long period of fieldwork between 2022 and 2023 in the rural outskirts of Bokhtar in southern Tajikistan. During that period, I interviewed and spent time with former migrant workers who had returned home, some temporarily, others more permanently, as well as with aspiring migrants who were looking for ways to leave, and their families. In Tajikistan's Vakh Valley, seasonal migration to Moscow, St. Petersburg, Yekaterinburg, and other Russian cities has shaped the biographies of an entire generation of men who were born after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Although they have grown up in a formally independent country, many of them make note of the fact that Tajikistan's economy is as deeply enmeshed with metropolitan Russia as it was during the heyday of Soviet power. As you can see on this chart with Tajikistan at the top, migrant remittances add up to almost 50% of Tajikistan's GDP, which means that every other dollar that circulates in Tajikistan's economy is money that a migrant worker has sent home. In addition to this economic dependence, the residents of this rural region frequently complain of migration's harmful effects on the local social fabric. Many worry about children growing up with absent fathers, about the women that have been left behind by their migrant husbands who secretly establish a second family abroad. What concerns me in this talk is a separate set of moral worries and anxieties about widespread outmigration that have to do with the value and status of migrant labor itself, the kinds of activities in which migrants engage to make a living abroad, the means through which they obtain employment, as well as the social relations in which they are embedded as workers. In what follows, I explore the dilemmas that arose for my interlocutors from engaging in morally perilous work, as well as their understandings of permissible and religiously endorsed economic activity. I demonstrate how migrancy in Tajikistan is perceived paradoxically as both an obstacle to and the means of one's moral and social becoming. And I show what these dilemmas reveal about migrants' aspirations and moral goals. In the immediate aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it seemed as though there would be a mass exodus of Central Asian migrant workers from Russia. When I arrived in Tajikistan in June 2022, however, it became clear that, much like the pandemic or other recent crises, the war had not stopped Tajiks from traveling to Russia in search of work. What Russia's invasion had done, however, was it gave rise to a new development. Everyone I talked to during these first few months knew someone, a relative, a neighbor, a former classmate, who was now working in one what could call Tajikistan's far abroad, picking strawberries in Scotland, driving trucks across the European Union, working in construction in South Korea, or delivering food and prescription medicine in New York. The excitement that this development caused in a country where labor migration had become almost synonymous with Russia was so palpable that it inevitably became the subject of heated discussions at neighborhood gatherings and communal ceremonies. Also in Central Asia at large, the excitement and the kind of frenzy with finding new migration routes was discussed in public. In this Uzbek cartoon, we see a man who has just received a rejection from the US green card lottery on his laptop, who's then picking up a Spanish textbook to prepare for a trip to Mexico to then cross the US-Mexican border. And the Uzbek cartoonist Habikatura illustrates here his countrymen's newfound fixation with finding ways to move to the West. What struck me about the way my interlocutors reflected on this novelty is how talk about Europe and the West lends itself to implicit commentary about working conditions and the treatment of Tajiks in Russia. The shock of the invasion, the images of death and destruction in Ukraine, and the real threat that Tajik migrants could also be drafted into Russia's war of aggression gave people an acute awareness of the discrimination and violence that so many Central Asian migrants in Russia have to endure. Beyond instances of forced conscription at the threat of deportation, there are also attempts to proactively involve migrant workers in the Russian war. Here you can see Tajik and Uzbek language flyers by the Russian Ministry of Defense that promise foreigners who sign a contract for military service a fast track to citizenship. And this repurposed Soviet-era poster calls on people to send their immigrant neighbors to the conscription office. There are also many cases of migrant workers who were promised jobs in Russia but ended up working in occupied Ukraine near the front lines. In my earlier interviews with returned migrant workers prior to the war, when I asked them about their experiences in Russia, they would present their oftentimes harrowing living and working conditions as common, indeed as something to be expected. The violence that migrants experience is rarely spectacular, and many had become used to wage theft, to the everyday racism and institutionalized discrimination, the extortion and abuse. But the war in Ukraine and the concrete risk of ending up on the front lines spurred a new kind of critical reflection and evaluation of their experiences. What is more, the war also made migration to Europe a viable opportunity for many Tajiks for the first time. This kind of counterintuitive development is shown in this chart. Following Ukraine's invasion and the declaration of martial law, Ukrainian men were prohibited from leaving their country, which prior to the invasion was the largest source of migrant workers for the European Union and the United Kingdom. And you can see how this, here in blue, the line drastically drops off after the invasion. Because British farms could no longer recruit men from Ukraine to fill seasonal jobs as field laborers, UK-based foreign recruitment companies scrambled to find cheap and expendable farmhands just as the growing season was about to start. Tajikistan, along with other Central Asian countries, emerged as an alternative for agencies who were used to sourcing workers from countries where Russian was widely spoken. And this new British recruitment scheme brings me to my first ethnographic vignette. In late February 2023, I was having a festive dinner of rice pilaf with Shafkat and his uncle Zafar. Shafkat, a young father of two, had invited us to the house that he shared with his parents and his brother to celebrate the fact that his application for the UK Agricultural Worker Scheme had been approved. Zafar, a gregarious man in his 40s, had not heard back about his own application, but he was all the happier for Shafkat to have been selected. It was good for young people to see the world, Zafar said, adding that he was worried that he himself was too used to working in Russia to undertake something this new and different. Zafar, whose school education had been interrupted by the civil war that was ravaging in Tajikistan's south during his youth, had spent the better part of the last 2 decades making a living in Russia. Starting out as a farmhand near Voronezh, he worked many years as a cart puller and vendor on the notorious Cherkizovsky market in Moscow until it was shut down by the Russian authorities. This was followed by stints as a construction worker in St. Petersburg and a job at a Korean-owned auto parts factory outside Moscow. But with every year, Zafar told me, he was dreading it more and more. The 14-hour work shifts, the openly discriminatory treatment vis-à-vis his Russian colleagues, who both earned more and worked less hard, the constant harassment and extortion from the police, and, to Zafar the most insulting, the racial slurs that he, who was only trying to mind his own business, would frequently hear shouted his way in the courtyard after a long day at work. When he was younger, Zafar said this was all easier to ignore, but with increasing age, which also demands increasing respect in a society where reverence for elders is so central to propriety as it is in Tajikistan, he felt that the abusive remarks and humiliating treatment became too much to bear. Being treated with decency proved elusive in Russia, despite Zafar's relatively high standing as an experienced migrant worker who was valued by his Russian employers. If work in Russia meant moral degradation of a kind that may be temporarily endured but never overcome, Europe to him promised something different. Europa, which for every single Tajik migrant with whom I spoke self-evidently excluded Russia, promised not just higher wages. In Europe, Zafar assured his nephew over dinner, if you do honest work, you will be certain to reap its rewards. To work honestly, in Tajik halal korkadan, literally to work in a halal way, was the phrase that Zafar and many others used to express this desired form of labor. I had previously noticed how migrant workers used halal and its antonym haram, which are Islamic terms that delineate the permissible and the forbidden in relation to diet, but also in relation to broader questions of everyday conduct. And I asked Zafar what kind of work would classify as halal. He explained that to work in a halal manner meant to work free from deceit, that is, both free from being deceived as well as from having to deceive others. You can also see this widespread usage of Islamic terminology in this job ad that itself is of questionable reliability, but that promises halal money for work in England that I found in Tajikistan, in the village where I was doing my research. This morally secure status of migrant labor in Europe, always implicitly or explicitly compared to Russia, was expressed in various other ways. Being able to go about your own business undisturbed was another recurrent way of framing the same notion. Hechkas ba hechkas kor nadorat is a Tajik saying that literally means nobody has any business with anyone else. But it was almost always mentioned in relation to the police and immigration authorities, and it expressed the surprising situation that police officers in Britain were not always out to get you. One of my interlocutors, after his return from the UK, would entertain his guests with a story of how he and a few colleagues on their day off had taken the bus to London to go sightseeing. On Tower Bridge, they were getting ready to take a selfie when a police officer approached them. Terrified, they sent the one English speaker among them to explain that they all had valid work visas. But to everyone's disbelief, the policeman simply offered to take a photo of them. The story never failed to draw laughter from the assembled men, all of whom had found themselves in similar situations in Russia, but who did not expect to emerge from them with their shared humanity acknowledged. Being left alone in this positive sense of the term, that is, being free to simply do your work and spend your free time as you please, including practicing your religion as you like, without being singled out as a migrant worker and therefore less deserving of human decency. These were seen as the ethically propitious qualities of migrant labor in Europe. I want to be careful to note that many such accounts were secondhand or sometimes even based entirely on hearsay. But I'm less interested in their truth value, in the truth value of these stories, than what they can tell us about what forms of sociality Tajik migrants see as desirable, and which kinds of work and comportment they see as conducive to moral personhood. The place of Europe within this moral economy is also unstable and liable to shift. In May 2023, I met up with Zafar near his maternal uncle's house in the south of Dushanbe. Zafar, who didn't get selected for one of the coveted British work visas, had also decided against going to Russia, instead spending his time caring for his elderly aunt and doing repairs in his house. We gave Shafkat, his nephew, a call, who had recently begun work on a farm harvesting lettuce near Cambridge. 3 weeks had passed since his departure, and Shafkat's messages had gotten less frequent. On the other end of the video call, we could see that Shafkat had visibly lost weight, and he sidestepped questions about working conditions on the farm. Only when Zafar asked him directly whether work in England was all that people made it out to be, whether it was worth the risk, did Shafkat reveal what had been going on. It transpired that their Ukrainian shift supervisor in England had been docking Shafkat's and all the other Central Asians' pay to redistribute it among his Ukrainian employees. Everyone was getting paid according to a piece rate, which means that their wages depended on how much lettuce they were able to pick. But no matter how hard Shafkat and his compatriots tried, they barely made minimum wage. Hearing this made Zafar furious, and he cursed Shafkat's supervisor as a haram khor, literally a haram eater, someone who earns his living through illicit means by taking someone else's fair share. Zafar seemed disheartened, and this went against his conviction that doing honest work was not just valued in Europe, but provided a way to steer clear of all manner of illicit and immoral activities. Disappointments like these seem to confirm the doubters among my interlocutors that working abroad always required getting entangled in unethical dealings. And this was all the more so since corrupt middlemen had inserted themselves into each and every step of the way, on the way to Britain. I now come to the final part of my talk today, which deals with a moral dilemma that arises from immobility. That is, the fact of being physically stuck and the feeling of being stuck. To be stuck at home after being deported, for example, is for many migrant workers a miserable situation to find oneself in. But what I realized throughout my research is that for many, the fact that one is moving constantly and relentlessly can also contribute to the feeling of being stuck, of failing to experience the progress through mobility that migration promises. Let me explain what I mean. Shafkat, after realizing that the British farms were part of an underground migrant economy not too dissimilar from what he had experienced in Russia, no longer wanted to put up with the backbreaking and exploitative labor. His problem was that his temporary work visa in Britain was sponsored by the recruitment agency that had brought him over, and that he was legally bound to this company. He couldn't change jobs and could only ask to be moved to a different farm serviced by the same agency. To avoid getting in trouble with his employer, Shafkat booked a return flight to Tajikistan, which he showed to his manager to prove that he was leaving the UK. He then promptly canceled the booking and got on a bus to London. His British work visa was still good for a few months, but he quickly realized that he couldn't change his visa status nor find formal employment. In the end, he found a job as a gardener in South London with no fixed schedule and payment in cash. He left the UK before his visa expired, hoping to be able to return soon on a different kind of visa that would allow him to work where he wanted. Shafkat returned home to Tajikistan before I finished my field research there, and initially he was overjoyed to see his family again. But within a couple of weeks, he showed a certain kind of restlessness that I noticed is common among returned migrant workers. In his research with temporary migrant workers from Egypt and the Gulf, the anthropologist Zamuli Shilke has shown how these migrants lived their life as if in a state of deferral. When in migration, their everyday life appears less than real because it revolves almost entirely around work. Due to their temporary status, many of them try to work as much as possible in the relatively short time that they are abroad, taking no days off and moving only from their housing to their place of work and back. This is all done in the service of a future life of stability, that these men imagine themselves having once they have saved up enough money to marry, build a house, and start a family. But most of the time, migrants manage to save up less money than expected, and it is their return home that ends up being a temporary one. A return that is consumed by plans for the next move abroad, the next temporary migrant job, with the hoped for future of stability when one doesn't need to move, deferred again. The material embodiment of this deferred future Schielke shows are the half-finished houses of migrant workers that one can see on the cover of the Arabic version of his book on the right. Similar half-finished houses dot the landscape in rural Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, houses that will be lived in one day when the future without the need for movement will have arrived. But until that point, it is the inability to move and a corresponding feeling of immobility that returned migrants such as Shafkat experience, and that they try to overcome in their restless search for new paths and opportunities abroad. Shafkat almost immediately began looking for ways to return to Britain, but he soon realized that things had become more difficult. With more and more Central Asians eager to find work in Europe and Russia's war in Ukraine continuing, it was increasingly challenging to get a visa or work permit. Corruption had become rife. Tajik language social media and messenger apps were full of companies that promised employment abroad in exchange for astronomical sums of money, money that Shafkat didn't have. Instead, what followed was yet another kind of deferral, waiting. Forced or unwanted immobility, as many scholars of migration have shown, can be just as detrimental to a person's well-being as forced movement. And in Shafkat's case, it led to feelings of shame, guilt, and regret, and eventually conflicts with his family. Waiting and idling, oftentimes expressed through the Tajik word for sitting, shishtan, are negatively connoted activities, especially for young men who are supposed to be busy and active to fulfill their breadwinner role. And to be known to be sitting at home is doubly shameful in a context where most young men are abroad, working and sending money to their families. Shafkat would try to avoid leaving the house so as not to run into his neighbors and get asked how his job search was going. I saw Shafkat again this January in Berlin, of all places. I was home in Germany for the holidays, and Shafkat, together with a friend of his from Tajikistan, had found a job renovating a rundown apartment that the new owner wanted to put on the rental market. Shafkat had arrived in Berlin via a circuitous route. Last summer, he had finally managed to get a work visa for Bulgaria. This was yet another poorly paid seasonal farm labor job, but Bulgaria had just joined the European Union's Schengen free travel zone, and within days, Shafkat and his friend left for Poland. There, they got a short-term residence permit through a middleman. Unable to find a well-paying job in Warsaw, they moved on to Berlin. When I met Shafkat there, he showed the same kind of restlessness that I had noticed before I left Tajikistan. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me that he and his friend hadn't been paid in 2 months. Their boss, a middleman from Chechnya, who handled the renovation on behalf of the apartment's real owner, told them that there were issues with receiving the required construction materials. Their agreement was that they would only get paid once they had finished their job. But this meant that Shafkat was behind on rent for his bed in a room that he shared with 2 other foreigners in an apartment on the outer fringes of Berlin that an old Russian lady rented out to migrant workers. Shafkat told me that he would have to move again, this time to Denmark. A friend working in a hotel not far from Copenhagen had told him that they were looking for staff. This, Shafkat hoped, would finally be a well-paying job that would allow him to pay back his debts, support his family, and build a house in Tajikistan. What Shafkat was looking for was a state of stability that the Lebanese-Australian anthropologist Ghassan Haj calls existential mobility. Existential mobility, he says, is the sense of being able to move forward in one's life and attain an ideal state of relative non-movement. Until reaching that point of stability, Shafkat would have to keep moving and would remain stuck in the state of having to move relentlessly without attaining true mobility. This moral dilemma between failing to progress at home and living up to the expectations that Tajikistan's patriarchal society places on men, and remaining in a state of relentless movement abroad that fails to translate into the hoped for stability, puts migrants like Shafkat in a form of double alienation. Alienated work combined with alienation from the life he worked so hard to build. His Bulgarian visa and the Polish papers had long expired when I met him in Berlin, and I warned him that Denmark had, in line with a broader European anti-immigrant sentiment, reintroduced checkpoints on the German-Danish border. But Shafkat replied that he would have to keep moving forward. I'll have to take a risk, he said. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take some questions. Just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you if you have one.
Hi, that was an excellent talk. Can you say a few words about that region before the Soviet era?
How many words do I have? Well, so Central Asia, I guess as the region is defined today, is a product of the Soviet Union, and before that, Russian imperialism. Before the countries that today make up Central Asia were colonized by Russia, so before the 19th and 18th century, there was actually a lot more exchange and connection to places in South Asia, to other parts of the Islamic world. And like going back to the Middle Ages, was contemporary Uzbekistan in particular, cities like Samarkand and Bukhara were really central nodes of learning, of knowledge exchange. And they were also places that showed a mix of languages. Much of Central Asia, the populations there speak languages that are part of Turkic, so fall within Turkic language families. But Persian had been the language of the court, the language of government, the language of letters, of poetry. And especially in cities, there was a kind of bilingualism. But then with the creation of the Soviet Union and the decision to establish the Soviet Union based on constitutive national republics, there was a kind of hardening of boundaries and lines and self-identifications. To call oneself an Uzbek is a modern phenomenon, but it comes from an old tribal name. But the state of Uzbekistan was a Soviet creation, and similar things hold true for Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and the other countries of Central Asia.
Can you explain, you were talking about the desire and the need to migrate to work. Mm-hmm. Can you explain what the work situation is and the economic situation is in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan that drives that? Yeah. And can it be changed?
Yeah. Well, so in the places where I did research, which are pretty rural, some people do find work in a close-by city, for example. But the problem is that wages are so low that in some cases, even just the transportation costs, the money for gas, or like a shared car to work, eats up most of the salary that people earn. So there's really very little in terms of employment that that could sustain families. It is possible, and some people do kind of maintain subsistence through farming. People usually own small plots of land. But anything that goes beyond that, things like, say, trying to build a house, or, I don't know, buying a car, or paying for your daughter's wedding, all of that requires money that simply cannot be found in Tajikistan. And the other issue is that even the people that do try to make an effort, for example, to open their own business in Tajikistan, they very quickly run up against the problem of endemic corruption. A friend of mine who also went to Britain to work on farms for a couple of months, after he returned to Tajikistan, he used the money that he saved to open a language school. He wanted to teach other people English, which all of a sudden was a desirable language to know. But the problem was that because he didn't have the necessary connections to the government, he needed to find someone who would basically protect him from police or from inspections, and who took more than half of the money that he was earning, and that the school had to shut down within a few months.
Especially with what's going on in Europe, it's clear that these migration patterns are going to be harder and harder to sustain, to give living. And yet, the only long-term solution would seem to be to develop an internal economy that would support them. And yet it seems almost impossible to develop that economy if over half the people are sending remittances.
Yeah.
Did you get involved at all with how developmental teams are trying to address this inherent contradiction in the situation they have now?
Yeah, before my PhD, I also spent some time working for the United Nations in Tajikistan, and was involved in a project that tried to, as it was called, to harness migration for development, which, basically the assumption was to put the money that migrants sent home to productive use in Tajikistan. But the issues that people ran up against were similar to the ones that I mentioned, that there really is no free market economy to speak of, and also the sums of money that we're talking about that migrants are sending home are sometimes really, they can support a family. They can maybe with time add up to extend a house, to pay for a children's education, to pay for surgery and healthcare treatment for your ailing parents. But these aren't huge sums of money that one could all of a sudden turn into a thriving business.
Well, I want to thank you, first of all, for a presentation that was really remarkably clear and earnest and jargon-free.
Thank you.
But I think as I heard your presentation, there's one part of it that really troubled me all the way through, and that is where you put up the flyers, the solicitation flyers from the Russian Defense Ministry, and you've focused on the migrants who've gone to Europe, which was very, very interesting. Not at all what I was expecting. But I'm wondering, how many people have gone down this chute, and what has happened to them? Because it seems to me the physical and moral peril that they would have faced would be far more extreme. And I wonder about how this affects the communities they've come from. I mean, how many of them are not returning from this war? How many are returning as cripples? What exists to provide health care and support for them, and what sort of economic arrangements have been made for them. I realize that in the current environment, this is a fantastically difficult thing to investigate, but I'm wondering, have you thought about that, and
Yeah.
how are you going to approach that?
Yeah. Well, so I personally didn't mean anyone directly who had taken part in the war, either by virtue of having been forced to or by having hoped to thereby gain Russian citizenship. But I know of people who have family members that did. I'm not sure that there are good and reliable statistics on how big of an issue that is. I know that sometimes the Ukrainian authorities publish lists of conscripts and in general Russian military personnel, and you do find Central Asian citizens in these lists, and Uzbekistan, I know for a fact, has also begun trying these people in court because according to Uzbek law it is illegal to serve in a foreign military. In Tajikistan, I don't think there have been any court cases or any recrimination from the government. And I also don't think that there's a way of responding to this issue on kind of a political level, on a state level, because it's these, Tajikistan especially still relies so heavily on Russia that doing something about this would, I think, easily be seen as a form of critique and could have repercussions for Tajikistan.
Well, I also thank you for a very clear presentation and enjoyed your focus on that one family and that one worker very much so. I wanted to ask you about the competition between Russia and China in Central Asia. It is, as you know, very strong, particularly in Kazakhstan because of the long border and the Chinese interest in the oil and gas, particularly. But I'm wondering whether the Chinese have had much of a presence in Tajikistan. I know in some countries they've offered fellowships, sent people to China. Could you talk a little bit about that, whether China plays a role in Tajikistan?
Yeah, it does. It certainly does, and China's influence is also growing. Not least as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine. You've already mentioned the fellowships. I know several people from Tajikistan that have received Chinese government scholarships for many Tajiks and Central Asians going to China for higher education has become something very desirable and prestigious, because also ways of going elsewhere, say to Europe or to the US, have almost disappeared, especially in terms of scholarship and public funding. Another way in which China is very present in Tajikistan is in its contribution to infrastructure, in building roads, kind of reconstructing roads that were built in the Soviet period but have kind of fallen into disrepair. And I think many Tajiks are very thankful and appreciative of the fact, but the reason that China is building these roads is not out of a sense of kind of altruism, but Tajikistan and Central Asia as a whole is kind of a key node on the continental path to Europe from China. And another reason why many roads are being built in Tajikistan is also because Chinese companies hold the right to mining gold and other metals, and the only way to get there is to build a road to these mountain villages, which, you know, the villagers are really happy about but none of that money ends up in Tajikistan. It's only it can support local economies because, for example, these companies will need drivers that drive the truck, or the Chinese companies mostly bring their own workers, and they need food. There's some contribution, some benefit, but it's not a kind of, it's hard to see how this could turn into a real driver of development in the region. Oh.
I have the mic. So one of the things that struck me about your story and sort of what you laid out for us was that powerful states and powerful economies almost require instability in a periphery region. And it's kind of through that extraction of resources, like you're talking about in terms of, Chinese interests, or I feel like within this realm of migrant labor, it's, obviously an attempt to build an entire food system on exploitative, like, labor practices, right? Mm-hmm. And so, as we sort of think about what that means, not just in Europe, but also the US, I'm kind of wondering, what do you think might happen, or do you have, like, any preliminary information on what's happening once the metropole or sort of like the center is actually in crisis? A lot of the current events that we're living through today, right, are throwing not just food systems, but, economies, right, into turmoil. And I'm wondering, what impact is that going to have, right, in the communities that you work with?
Thank you. That's a very important and deep question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to it. I mean, one way of thinking about it in terms of these inequalities that, in migration research get glossed as like destination countries and sending countries, that even that terminology implies a certain kind of equal status that really isn't there. But what I can say happened in this context of Central Asian migration from Russia and then to Europe is that there almost seems to be a sort of hierarchy within or among countries and ethnic groups. As you can see in the example that I gave with Central Asians kind of taking the place of Eastern Europeans working in England, and in Russia, for example, where it really migration from Central Asia has significantly decreased, but Russia still depends on migrant workers. The big cities like Moscow would be impossible to sustain without having, large groups of immigrant labor. That new immigrant labor now comes from South Asia, from Pakistan, from India. So it's the result doesn't seem to be a kind of disruption or pause or end to these kinds of inequalities, but it's like a shifting down almost. That's at least what I can say based on my research context.
Again, thanks for a great presentation. I enjoyed all the visuals too. I always do. But as I was listening to your talk, I want to come back around to the moral economy aspect. I was actually thinking of a book by Craig Jeffrey called Time Pass. It's about the students in India who study for years to take the Indian Administrative Service exam, the IAS exam, and very few pass. And if you do pass, you get a good job in the civil service. They spend years doing this. And I'm thinking of the structural similarities of years seeking employment, going, coming back, trying in what sound like very hopeless situations. And I'm just wondering, what is the role of hope in the moral economy of this exercise in efforts?
Yeah. Thank you for the question and also for the book reference. The role of hope, I think, is very important, and in the way I've been thinking about it, and also how I've been framing my dissertation, is how much of this hope also has a religious inflection, an Islamic inflection, which, I mean, I gave the kind of conceptual framing of Rizq and Rizq, and the fact that people are hopeful that their source of sustenance is somewhere out there. They believe it is out there. They know that if they struggle, they will find something. This is a very strong kind of notion derived from Islam, and I think hope is maybe a good way of thinking about it. I'm not sure people themselves would say that they're being hopeful. It is more a kind of both a stubbornness, but also a conviction that eventually they will find what they're looking for. But yeah, thank you for the question.
And we have a question on the chat from Graham McGuire, 8520. He asks, during the heyday of the Islamic State, up until at least the Crocus City bombings in Moscow in 2024, there was much discussion about alienated Central Asian migrants as a population particularly. Has that phenomenon evolved at all over the course of your fieldwork? And are there specific migration destinations where migrants are more or less likely to be approached in that way?
I myself haven't tried to answer these questions, haven't tried to approach these questions because they're obviously very politically sensitive in Tajikistan, and would have been, possibly a way of getting the people I was spending time with in trouble. What I can say to the question is, I mean, one of the events that was mentioned was the Crocus Hall bombing in Moscow that I haven't included in my talk. I think it happened in 2023. A group of Tajiks entered this concert hall outside Moscow and shot into the crowds and killed hundreds of people. The main result that it has had on the people that I know and the community where I worked is that it led to an even further crackdown on especially Tajik migrants in Russia. So the results or the effects and reverberations were felt by people more broadly, especially Tajiks, who were then in Russia singled out as somehow being responsible as a group for this event. And it has also led to the targeting of religious institutions, of mosques in Russia that are frequented by migrants, all out of this kind of idea of guilt by association. But I myself haven't really looked at what in the literature it gets called radicalization that happens in migration.
All right, is that it? Any more questions? Okay. Thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.